This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everyone to the Senate House and the School of Advanced Study. I'm Philip Murphy, I'm Deputy Dean of the school. It's our great pleasure to launch this report, a human rights assessment of hydraulic fracturing and other unconventional gas development in the United Kingdom. The report has been jointly produced by our own Human Rights Consortium, which is a very important part of the central operations of the School of Advanced Study, in conjunction with the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and Environment and Human Rights Advisory. And we have with us today two of the co-authors of this report, Grear from Cardiff Law School and Dr. Damien from our own Human Rights Consortium. But it is a particular pleasure, particular honour to introduce Bianca Jagger, the founder and chair of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, which has commissioned this important report, which calls on the British government to declare a moratorium on exploratory and extractive fracking operations until a proper investigation has been made into the human rights impact of fracking. We are very grateful to the Bianca Jagger Foundation and to Bianca Jagger herself for supporting this important initiative. Of course, I don't have to introduce Bianca Jagger. She is one of the most important, generous and tireless human rights campaigners of our age. The causes she has supported have been numerous and deeply significant. Having witnessed at first hand the brutality of the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, she campaigned in the 1980s against US government intervention against the Sandinista regime. She has actively opposed the death penalty and defended the rights of women and indigenous peoples around the world. She was a member of the 20th Century Task Force to apprehend war criminals. She was involved in the campaign to close Guantanamo Bay. She has campaigned already on the impact of fossil fuels on the environment, and as a recognition of her tremendous contribution to human rights, in November 2013, she delivered the 12th annual Longford Lecture entitled Ending Violence Against Women and Girls and the Culture of Impunity. Bianca, it's a great pleasure to have you here to launch this report.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that very impressive and undeserving introduction. As you heard, I'm Bianca Jagger, and I'm founder and chair of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation. I was asked to commission this report. I felt that it was really important to be behind it in every way possible. It's a report, as you already heard, calling on the UK government to investigate the human rights impact of fracking before authorizing any exploratory or extractive fracking operations. The report recommends a moratorium on all fracking operations until a transparent, independent, and publicly funded human rights impact assessment has been undertaken and placed in the public domain. One of the reasons why I felt that it was so important to commission this report and to support this report is that in spite of all the evidence available, our government in this country would like us to believe that rhetoric of state regulations, to believe in the rhetoric of state regulations, of job creations and cheap, clean energy to bridge a gap in our energy needs. The government is aware that loosening planning regulations for drilling could trigger a whole host of potential disasters, including water and soil contamination, flooding, landslide, noise pollution, land-threatening silica dust, traffic overload, and visual intrusion into the landscape. But we know the truth about fracking, and we know it from every other country that bear the scars of this fracking industry. The truth is that fracking causes contamination of aquifers, leakage of toxic chemicals into the ground, air pollution, earthquakes, and increased road traffic. And if allowed to go ahead and challenge, it will forever alter England's glorious countryside. And I feel that, and I felt that it was really important that the public at large has the right to see how it will impact the human right, the civil rights, and the rights overall. The UK government has given the green light to shale gas companies for fracking operation throughout the United Kingdom. They are rushing through changes to the law of trespass to speed up the ability of shale gas companies to frack under people's home without their consent. The rewriting of the law is being introduced despite widespread public concern about the health and environmental impact of fracking, and in the face of overwhelming public resistance from ordinary people. The infrastructure bill is a flagrant violation of our basic human right and of our democratic process. I think that you can see why I really believed. And who is next? Is it Hannah?
You did.
Yes.
Oh, me?
You.
Oh, me, okay. Thank you, Bianca. Well, I'll just talk for a few minutes about where we would like this to go next, because this is a sort of what we call a prima facie case for human rights impact assessments. It is basically sketching out the landscape which would be useful to local groups, advocacy networks, and hopefully, government would be interested as well. But principally, it's for people to use, But it's something I look at as a stepping stone. And what I'd like to see next would be something which I fear the government's a little bit concerned about, and that's using evidence-based analysis to inform a human rights impact assessment, which is much more broad and comparative. There's an awful lot of data coming out of the US now, which unfortunately doesn't make it into the policy documents that you read in the broad area of fracking discourse in the UK. And in particular, what's not really making its way into the public consciousness is what social scientists have been doing in the US now. So the debate is heavily science-based, and there's now really good emerging social science from the US in particular, which is looking at how people are experiencing living with fracking development. So what I would like to see in a much broader human rights impact assessment is taking on board people's experiences, what sociologists would call the lived experience of this. And what we've seen in the US is studies that look at the cumulative impacts. So not just what it's like a year or two in, but what it's like over 7 years. So unfortunately, they're sort of guinea pigs in a sense. But there are a number of really, really good studies now, some of whom have been working with myself, looking at what's been happening in Colorado. And what we find is that even when there's significant cash incentives early on, over a few years, communities are basically coming out and saying, unanimously in the studies that have been done so far, that the negatives outweigh the benefits. And that's in a context where there's much more ability for landowners to receive significant cash injections from these activities, but they have a different sort of state system in a sense. So none of that is really being taken on board by policymakers in the UK. So it's just, fine micro detail about scientific issues which aren't looking at the broad process of fracking development. In other words, there's a whole range of things which are important for people to consider, everything from truck traffic to where the compressor stations are. It's not just about what happens under the ground. There's some studies coming out of the US now that are saying one of the biggest dangers is big trucks, small roads, you know, and a lot of deaths have come from that. You know, so all of these things need to feature in a broad human rights impact assessment that can't just focus on the micro detail of how likely aquifers are to get polluted, etc. That's a small part of a somewhat big and more concerning picture. So that's what I'd like to see, and I think it has to be an interdisciplinary type of study. Okay, you need the science, you need the social science, and it needs to speak to each other as well. So that's what I'd like to see as a sort of where to next, in a sense. This is arguably a sort of call to arms, I think, you know, but it's only the first step, I think. So that's my few minutes worth. So Anna.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. I think it's really important actually for campaigning groups and activist groups and grassroots people to really get hold of this idea of the intimate relationship between human rights and the protection of the lives, the ordinary interests of ordinary people in this country. We're living through a time when we've got a government that not only is pushing through fracking in the light of very strong evidence that significantly undermines the strength of their arguments concerning the putative benefits of this technology. But we're living through a time in which the UK government is actually, or the Tory party at least, is trying to bring human rights themselves into considerable disrepute by impugning the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights. And we've got a sort of press that has quite widely misinformed the public about the very meaning of human rights and what they really stand for. And I think it's really interesting the way in which this fracking and human rights relationship, in a sense, throws mutual light on both these issues. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for all of us who care about the fundamental interests of ordinary people in this country, who actually care about the way that the government has relatively undemocratically pushed forward a largely corporation-driven agenda against the ordinary interests of people in this country, to actually celebrate human rights, what they really stand for, and rescue them from the widespread misappropriation of them by the press and by certain sectors of the political class. So I think this is a very timely moment, actually, in the history, in the political history of this nation, to bring these two highly contentious issues together. And I would like to also place those against the broader context of climate injustice more generally, and the shape of the kind of, if you like, the global political and juridical order, and the way in which we're seeing increasing evidence of a very strong neoliberal agenda, but still has yet to understand that we live in a world with ecological limits, that still has yet to understand that capitalism actually doesn't factor in these immense, invisibilized, deliberately sidelined human costs until they count as costs within the economy. Quite simply, that is not good enough. And quite simply, it is not good enough that this government has taken so little heed of the incredibly strongly expressed opinions of ordinary people all over this country, who absolutely feel to the depths of their being that they do not want to risk the pollution of aquifers, they do not want to risk the health and environmental effects of this technology. And it's very interesting to place that against the general jurisprudential movement in the European Court of Human Rights, where the court is moving increasingly to bring human rights together with the environment and to give those rights a very strong substantive and procedural content that places states under proactive duty to warn their citizens of risks, to take proactive steps to diminish environmental risks, and to provide public participatory rights in decision-making to do with environmental matters. It's very difficult to see how this government has honoured any of those standards. And it's extremely telling that missing from the fracking debate is this question of human rights and the impact of this technology on people's fundamental human interests and needs. So I think this is a very timely moment to issue this, and it's my hope that all the brave people who get out there on the streets, in front of trucks, and protest this will run with this argument, put it alongside the arguments they're making, and in the process that we can celebrate together a very rich tradition of human rights and actually resist this rights-attacking, undermining, undemocratic, kleptocratic governmental approach.
Thank you very much. Is the panel happy to take questions? Please on the... What was that? Yes, George.
What is the strategy there?
What was the question?
What is the strategy?
What is the strategy?
Yeah.
I mean, moving forward.
Yes.
Can you tell us your name, please? And
Oh,
where are
sorry.
you from?
Jared Byrne is my name. I'm on the course, the human rights course in the
Well,
university.
I guess the strategy has yet to develop fully, but initially we're going to get this out to as many organisations and institutions as possible. We're actually addressing it to 5 members of the House of Commons, so it's going to be sent out to George Osborne, Edward Daly, Jeremy Hunt, Eric Pickles, Elizabeth Truss. We're trying to get it in front of members of the political parties. We're going to actually also reach out globally to indigenous groups and other campaigning groups across the world, because there's an incredible need, I think, to reach out in partnership to people similarly positioned with similar concerns elsewhere. And we do have plans that we can't talk about for something fairly major in the future, but we can't talk about at this stage because it's confidential. But initially, my hope is that people pick it up and run with it and start tweeting it and get it to go viral and get it in the hands of people who are actually making the arguments on the ground, as well as in policy fora. So that's the next step, is to actually disseminate it as widely and strategically as we can. And then, as I said, we have got another step that's already in development, but we can't actually reveal at this point.
I'd add to that, I mean, the most important thing is to start using human rights in this discussion, actually. That's one of my biggest hopes, I think, is people start using the language of human rights in this context. I think that's going to be an important shift.
And not only to start using the language of human rights, but to start using the mechanisms that are available to us to question and challenge the government when they are violating our fundamental human rights and the democratic process.
Yes, please.
My name's Ruth Hayhurst, I'm a journalist. Your study is about fracking and unconventional oil and gas. I wondered if you thought about conventional oil and gas onshore, because it seems to me that at the moment nobody wants to mention the F word. So all the plans that are coming out are all being described as conventional exploratory wells. But many of the implications of fracking and unconventional also apply to conventional. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
I would agree with that, and I think the report actually picks up from that in a way, because the existing jurisprudence in the European Court of Human Rights is already dealing with fairly conventional industrial processes and toxins. This report, in a sense, extrapolates from the logic of those cases and the necessary inference of the kind of circumference of the reasoning in the cases to embrace fracking. But there's a lot of argument about the conventional issues in relation to human rights, in relation to human rights and the environment, and also the human rights linkages to climate change generally is being increasingly made at the UN and other sites. So yes, I think that's a very important argument, particularly this point you make about the kind of subterfuge involved. I think that's an important point to pick up on.
Absolutely, and all the case law in the report is based on what we call convention. So it's just an extension of that logic. And of course the idea behind the way in which we analyse this as extreme energy is those risks that you see with conventional are going to be magnified.
Great question.
Hi, I'm Jake White. I'm a lawyer at Friends of the Earth. This is great. 2 quick questions. One was the dandelion you get from government when you say, look, what's going on in the US is we'll do it differently here. We'll regulate it better. And in a human rights context, I wondered how the fact of environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment, in other words, saying there's been an assessment process, you can't possibly say there's anything now to worry about, plays in a human rights type context. The other point I just wanted to ask briefly was, are you expecting a response from government? Are you pushing for a response from government? Is there some kind of benefit to be derived from a direct dialogue with government, or are you more interested in the sort of wider pickup and wider sort of generating of interest?
In relation to that last question, I'd say both, ideally. Whether we'll get a response is an entirely different question, but Damien, you're better placed to answer the first part of the question.
The US one's interesting, you're absolutely right. I mean, having been at the Fracking North conference, that's basically how they dodged every single US bullet, shall we say. But, of course, we know that a lot of that doesn't stand up. There are necessarily going to be so many similarities that I think the best way of dealing with that argument is to basically put the burden back on those making the argument and say, exactly what do you mean it's going to be different? Will it require fewer truck journeys, etc., etc.? So, there will be some subtle differences, but I don't think they're so significant as to knock that argument out, So I think you just need to be aware that there will be differences, but will they be that significant? And of course you get the same arguments with our regulation will be gold standard as Friends of the Earth knows. With your regulation assessment, there are significant weaknesses, which I don't imagine will be addressed.
Can I ask a follow-up? It was really just. I take that. I guess I'm just concerned that within the sort of forum of a kind of human rights sort of court type forum, isn't the court quite likely to sort of wave a case by where a government or a regulator can say we've subjected it to assessment and we don't think the risks are all that great?
I mean, it's a question for lawyers, but I think the evidence is there, and I think it would stand up. I mean, the trouble with it is a lot of the time, the way the UK government deals with it is they put forward evidence, it's not peer-reviewed. More often than not, it's not produced by think tanks, etc., which are just regurgitated, spinned versions of other research. Whereas if you look at the latest actual peer-reviewed research coming out of the States, the evidence is significantly robust. But what you'll find is things like the Public Health England report, they'll have a cut-off date, which is very strange when you look at some of the latest research, is after that date. And these are peer-reviewed academic pieces, which should be part of our evidence-based analysis.
I'm Jennifer Hughesman. I'm a project researcher at the Human Rights Consortium. I haven't actually had a chance to read through the whole thing yet, but I was wondering if the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is touched on in this, or if maybe we can use this as a way to highlight that as well, because TTIP is essentially, it's going to be a number of governments. This is going to be another thing that's going to come in that the government's going to use to try to block protests where, these companies will actually be able to sue communities and governments who block them from activity that will make them lose profits. And not a lot of people know about this or are talking about this, and I don't know what your thoughts on, or maybe using this to highlight that as well.
Your domain.
I think we don't touch on it in this. Obviously, the two agendas are intimately related and there's no need to tie them together, but there's no reason why they can't actually mutually reinforce each other in the correct argumentative context when it's strategically useful to do so. But I spend a lot of my time looking at the legal construction of the global order. And for me, the TTIP and similar other arrangements, there's a Trans-Pacific Partnership as well, is part of a larger picture into which this clearly fits, which is this pro-corporate tilt to the legal order itself and to the global order itself, which is extremely problematic. And in a sense, it highlights the same sort of crux point of pressures where you're essentially asking how democratic neoliberal democracy is anymore. And so I think there are broader contextual settings in which it would be entirely appropriate to bring these two agendas together, even strategically at points, but that we wouldn't need to necessarily tie them together. There will be moments at which it's strategically important to keep them separate and to address the issues that arise in relation to them, but I think that's something that will unfold in different argumentative contexts. I think one of the things we have to realise and kind of celebrate in a way is that we have to be highly adaptive and flexible in the way that we approach the questions because of the rapidly mutating nature of the kind of discourse itself and the way in which corporate power, and I'm not tarring all corporations with the same brush by any means, but the way in which certain formations of corporate power have an uncanny ability to reinvent themselves in the languages of the kind of progressive values that seek to mitigate the social fallout of some of the practices some of the worst practices that we see in neoliberalism. So I think that this invites, if you like, some very context-sensitive, context-specific thinking about how to present argumentative strategies, and I think that's a really interesting question, so thank you for it.
I think I would add to that. I think a number of the UK local anti-fracking groups are aware of the potential dangers, and you start to see there are social media campaigns, etc., and petitions and things that identifying the potential there is within that proposal for fracking development. So again, it's people are making the connections.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question to Bianca? You mentioned earlier when we were talking about how to take this campaign forward, and you said we should use the language of human rights, but also the mechanisms. And I was wondering, with your huge experience of those global human rights mechanisms, what sorts of agencies or organisations were you thinking of?
Well, in the report, there is something very important. It says, the UK is legally bound to respect and protect human rights, both under the auspices of its own Human Rights Act 1998 and of the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms 1950. The UK is also bound to respect international human rights law, which includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, CCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I think that it will be very important that we, and it is within my foundation, one of the things that I did is that when I started, I founded the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, but I've been working on human rights and social justice for over 30 years. And when I started working on environmental issues, a lot of people say, but why a human rights organization would be involved in environmental issues? And I think that a lot of organizations today see that environmental issues and the rights of people are really human rights when it comes to the violation of communities and individuals and indigenous people. And I feel that the way this report approaches how we can stand up to fracking is very important, is to give that angle of the fundamental human rights violations that we are experiencing, and as well of the democratic process. So I think that this is something that we must keep in mind and that we must use to challenge what these corporations are doing and how they are affecting, the well-being and the well-being of individuals and communities and the average citizen in this country and throughout the world.
I think I'd add to that as well, but the other thing we should think about from the perspective as academics as well is that, rare I say this, but we shouldn't ignore the UN either. I mean, the important thing with the UN within this context is that they have a special rapporteur system, and there are a number of special rapporteurs who are becoming increasingly interested in fracking. Special rapporteur for water and sanitation, for example, in her report on the US, specifically mentioned fracking as a concern for water. So there's an agenda there that people could feed into, and us as academics in particular could provide them with what they call indicator data, and every now and again they put out a call to receive indicator data, in other words, data about people's experiences pertinent to the particular rights in question. So there's recently been a call that's come across my sort of in email inbox from the UN Environmental Programme, for example, asking for data. Also from the Special Procedures of the Human Rights Commission looking for indicator data about human rights defenders in the environmental realm, because the UN is particularly worried because environmental human rights defenders are now seen as one of the most at-risk groups. So, you know, there's a means by which we can use the mechanisms of human rights by, you know, helping the UN with its data collection. It doesn't have an enormous amount of money. Special rapporteurs are often, you know, academics themselves who are overworked, underpaid, as they may say, and, you know, aren't really in a position, because the UN is not going to give them tons of money, to go and actually do field work. You know, so they are reliant on, you know, one or two researchers, and, you know, when you read the reports, as powerful as they often are, they are limited. So I think one of the things that, you know, interested people can do in this field is help provide and disseminate data and help collect it too.
Thank you very much indeed.
I was thinking recently that, in a sense, the whole issue may become redundant if the price of gas continues to fall, because there has to be a limit below which it's uneconomic to frack. And in America, it seems that they have pulled back on developing more fracking sites because the price of gas has dropped so much over there. And something similar. I mean, I just have wondered. I've been waiting to see in the United Kingdom whether they may comment about it, because it won't be worth a while for companies to frack. It won't be economic any longer. And in fact, the UK government might like to present itself as human rights defenders and drop the whole thing, whereas in fact the real reason is because it won't pay all their corporate friends to go and do it.
Quite possibly. I think what's really important, and I think, yes, I mean, the economic case for fracking is dodgy anyway, isn't it? There's a lot of very serious, well-respected institutions that have come out and cast considerable doubt on the economic case for fracking anyway. And obviously the economic imperatives will be decisive, but I think it's very important that we don't concede the arguments of principle at any point.
Absolutely.
Even in anticipation of that. It's absolutely fundamental that we actually challenge this marketised monopoly that seems to be so, I don't know if the word's comfortable, but so unaware or willing to discount these fundamental issues of impacts on ordinary people's lives. And so the arguments of principle and the arguments from fundamental human interests have to be front and centre.
You see, I think environmental health is one of the areas in which they're very vulnerable. I read the House of Lords report, which quoted the Public Health England report, and I read the Public Health England report really carefully, and Public Health England were very, very nuanced in what they wrote. And they talked about based on currently available evidence. That was the phrase they used. That there wouldn't be environmental health impacts. Currently available evidence available to them. What does that mean?
Yeah. And nobody, the timeline that was artificially constructed to discount rows of important data.
And I was at a meeting about 6 months ago in the Royal Society of Medicine. I'm a doctor. In the Royal Society of Medicine, and it was a meeting on fracking by the Faculty of Environmental Health, and I challenged them as to why they had not challenged the Public Health England report, and there's a lot of shifting in seats about it. I think it's an area that one could go after, that would produce a lot of benefit in terms of stopping.
That's really interesting.
I'll just say before we move on to Catherine, if you one of the things that's interesting to look at, if you look at the actual trends in the US, it's not as simple as that. You get these peaks and troughs with the gas prices. And often these things are said as if people won't actually go and find out for themselves. And this is the accurate data from the US Energy Information Administration. It's not as simple as the prices are a lot cheaper. It goes up and down, and you get these peaks and troughs. But to understand extreme energy and the limits to growth, these things will only get more expensive over a period of time because there's a finite supply. You know, so I think it is important to stick to principled arguments because things will run out at some point. But generally speaking, the gas price picture is simply more complicated than it's portrayed. Sorry, Catherine.
Well, just going back to that for a minute, that wasn't what I was going to say, but there was an article in an Argentinian paper a couple of days ago about Saudi Arabia specifically keeping the market flooded and the oil price low, well, in order to scupper the American shale industry, and Saudi Arabia saying that they could keep this up for 3 years because their oil flows easily, their costs are much lower, and they can do this for 3 years if necessary, just to do the job. So that was that. But I just wanted to say as well, I'm from Balkan, and when the public, what's it called, the medical? Public Health England report came out, we actually did our own rubbishing of that report and sent it into the Lords Committee, and well, we have a professor of physics in the village who worked with medic friends, and I edited it in fact, and even up to where they got to, leaving out the modern stuff, it was just full of holes and full of misinformation and lacking information.
Do we have any further questions? If not, well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you.